I have presided over tens of thousands of cases during my decades on the bench. I have seen every type of scam, every flavor of entitlement, and every mask people wear to hide their deceit. But there is a specific breed of arrogance that always catches my attention: the wealthy landlord who mistakes his bank balance for supreme intelligence. I remember this one case vividly, not because of the initial dispute, which appeared to be a standard security deposit issue, but because a smug, highly privileged man stood in my courtroom, completely ignored my direct warning, and actually laughed in my face. Exactly 3 minutes later, he was crying, real panic tears. And believe me when I tell you this, the entire gallery was absolutely stunned by how rapidly his ivory tower collapsed. Before I delve into the details of this spectacular downfall, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more gripping courtroom takedowns just like this one. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Let me set the scene and take you back to where this disaster truly began. The defendant was Richard Sterling. He owned dozens of commercial and residential properties across the city. Richard did not simply walk into my courtroom, he paraded into it. He wore a bespoke tailored suit, a luxury watch that likely cost more than my bailiff's annual salary, and a permanent smirk that suggested he was deeply inconvenienced by the very concept of the legal process. He looked at the plaintiff, a 28-year-old single mother named Sarah, who had been renting one of his luxury apartments like she was, something he had scraped off the bottom of his Italian leather shoe. Sarah was suing Richard for the return of her $5,000 security deposit, plus damages for an illegal lockout. When Sarah stood at the plaintiff's podium, her hands were shaking, but she was prepared. She had brought meticulously organized folders, printouts of ignored maintenance requests, and detailed bank statements. Richard, on the other hand, brought almost nothing, just a sleek, empty leather briefcase and his overwhelming sense of superiority. He assumed his wealth and presence alone would intimidate the room into submission. He assumed wrong. Sarah began her testimony. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but the truth has a way of steadying people. She explained that she had rented a 2-bedroom unit in one of Richard's downtown properties for exactly 3 years. She never missed a single rent payment. She never caused a disturbance. When her lease was finally up, she gave the proper 60-day notice, cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, and handed over the keys. According to the law, her $5,000 security deposit should have been returned within 30 days. Instead, 60 days passed, then 90. When she finally threatened legal action, Richard didn't just ignore her emails, he illegally changed the locks on the basement storage unit where she was keeping her remaining furniture, demanding a fabricated deep cleaning fee before he would release her personal belongings. I turned my attention to the defendant. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet courtroom, "you withheld a $5,000 deposit and locked this young woman out of her storage. Explain yourself." Richard leaned casually against the wooden podium. He slouched, as if standing at attention was somehow beneath his tax bracket. "Your Honor," he began, sighing loudly as if he were forced to explain basic mathematics to a toddler. "The tenant left the property in a completely unacceptable state. The carpets were ruined, the walls needed repainting, and the appliances were filthy. $5,000 barely covered the physical damage." "Fascinating," I replied, opening Sarah's remarkably organized folder, "because I am looking at time-stamped photographs taken by the plaintiff on the exact day she vacated. The carpets look professionally steamed. The walls are pristine. The oven looks like it hasn't even been cooked in." I held up the glossy photographs for him to see. Richard didn't even blink. He simply waved his hand dismissively. "Pictures can be deceiving, Your Honor. I have a professional team of property managers who assess the unit. We had to hire contractors immediately to fix what she broke." "Excellent," I said, leaning forward and folding my hands. "Then, you must have brought the invoices. You must have the receipts from these contractors, showing the $5,000 worth of work. Show them to me." That is when Richard Sterling made his first fatal error. He chuckled, a low, arrogant, patronizing sound that echoed in the silent room. "I don't handle microscopic day-to-day receipts, Judge. I own 30 properties in this city alone. I assure you, my management team handled the billing internally. It is standard procedure." I stared at him. Years on the bench teach you to recognize the exact moment a manipulator mistakes a judge for a fool. In my courtroom, Mr. Sterling, the standard procedure is called evidence. You do not get to keep $5,000 of someone else's money based on your personal, verbal assurance. He smiled, completely unfazed by the warning. Well, perhaps the court doesn't fully understand how high-end real estate operates. The gallery gasped softly. Sarah looked terrified, gripping the edges of her podium. But I didn't yell. Anger is a reaction, and I never give arrogant people the emotional reaction they are looking for. Instead, I quietly picked up another document from the very back of Sarah's file. Let's talk about how your high-end real estate operates, Mr. Sterling, because this case just stopped being about a dirty carpet. I held up a single sheet of paper from the back of Sarah's meticulously organized folder. It wasn't a photograph of a clean wall, and it wasn't a copy of a lease agreement. It was a wire transfer confirmation. When tenants rent property, the law is explicitly clear about how their money must be handled. Security deposits are not a bonus. They are not a tip. They belong to the tenant, and they must be placed in a separate, interest-bearing escrow account. I looked at the routing information on the transfer. Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. According to this bank record, Sarah's $5,000 was wired directly into an account named Sterling Innovations, LLC. Is that a dedicated escrow account? Richard shifted his weight, crossing one expensive leather shoe over the other. The smirk remained, though his eyes darted toward the paper in my hand for a fraction of a second. It's a holding company, Your Honor, standard corporate structuring. I have accountants who manage the flow of capital. I am not asking about the flow of capital, I replied, staring directly at him. I am asking if you commingled a tenant's legally protected security deposit with your corporate operating funds. He let out an exasperated breath, the kind a parent gives a child asking too many questions. Money is money, Judge. It all ends up under my umbrella anyway. I don't see why a banking technicality matters when she clearly destroyed my property. A banking technicality. That phrase told me everything I needed to know about Richard Sterling. To people who believe their wealth and power shield them from accountability, the law is nothing more than a series of inconvenient technicalities meant for the working class. But arrogance makes people sloppy. When you genuinely believe that consequences only happen to other people, you stop covering your tracks. I turned my attention back to Sarah. Miss Hayes, how did you get the internal account details for Sterling Innovations, LLC? Sarah stood up a little straighter. Her voice was much firmer now. He accidentally sent me a spreadsheet, Your Honor. He meant to send me a PDF invoice for the fabricated cleaning fee he was demanding, but he attached the wrong file to the email. Richard's posture suddenly changed. The casual, arrogant slouch vanished instantly. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands dropped rigidly to his sides. I noticed the physical shift immediately. It is fascinating how the human body reacts when a hidden truth is suddenly brought to the surface. The transition from supreme annoyance to sudden, sharp alertness was undeniable. What spreadsheet? Richard snapped, stepping closer to his podium, his voice losing its polished, wealthy drawl. I didn't look at him. I looked down at the next document in the folder. It was a printed, multi-page Excel sheet. And as my eyes scanned the columns, the dates, and the massive repeating numerical values, I realized Richard Sterling wasn't just a bad landlord trying to steal a security deposit. He was playing a much, much more dangerous game. I adjusted my glasses and looked closer at the document. It was a master ledger for Sterling Innovations, LLC, spanning the last 5 years. It detailed not just Sarah's $5,000, but hundreds of identical deposits. Row after row, column after column of security deposits from dozens of properties, all being funneled into this single corporate account. But that wasn't the most damning part. Next to each deposit was a column labeled reallocation, where the funds were immediately transferred out to offshore holding accounts, effectively masking the income from state and federal tax regulators. I looked up at Richard. The blood had completely drained from his face. The arrogant, untouchable landlord who had laughed at me just moments ago now looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. Mr. Sterling? I said, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the courtroom. Are you aware of what this document is? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against the collar of his expensive custom shirt. The psychological collapse of an arrogant person is always fascinating to witness. They spend their entire lives building a fortress of wealth and intimidation, convinced that their money makes them invincible. But when confronted with undeniable, hard evidence of their own criminality, that fortress crumbles into dust instantly. Let me read this into the record, I continued, holding the paper high so the entire gallery could see it. Tenant deposit, $4,500, transferred to Cayman Holdings. Tenant deposit, $6,000, transferred to Sterling Overseas. You haven't just been stealing from young women like Sarah. You have been systematically laundering millions of dollars of tenant money to evade federal taxes, haven't you? The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. My bailiff took a subtle step closer to the defendant's podium. Richard's hands were now gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. Your Honor, he finally choked out, his voice cracking. That document is private corporate property. It was unlawfully obtained. You cannot use it. Wrong again, Mr. Sterling, I replied sharply. You sent it to her. Voluntarily, which means it is now a matter of public record, and I am looking at a massive, orchestrated tax fraud scheme right here in my courtroom. It was a misunderstanding, Richard stammered. The smooth, booming voice that had filled my courtroom just 10 minutes earlier had completely evaporated. Now, he sounded like a terrified child caught stealing from a cash register. Your Honor, you have to understand, my accountants handle the offshore routing. I don't look at the microtransactions. This is a witch hunt over a dirty carpet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence in the room was already deafening enough. A witch hunt? I asked, looking over the top of my glasses. Mr. Sterling, you walked into this room believing you were untouchable. You stood at that podium, wearing a suit worth a down payment on a house, and you laughed at this court. You laughed at the very idea that you should have to prove your fabricated damages. And now, when your own ledger exposes a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation, you want to blame your accountants? Richard took a step back, his polished veneer cracking into a million irrecoverable pieces. The sheer terror in his eyes was absolute. People who use their wealth as a weapon to bully those beneath them operate on a very specific illusion. They believe they can buy their way out of reality. But reality had just arrived, printed in black and white on a spreadsheet he had accidentally emailed to a 28-year-old single mother. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling so violently that the microphone barely picked it up. He looked around the courtroom, but no one was coming to rescue him. He hadn't bothered to bring his expensive corporate lawyers because he genuinely thought a small claims dispute was beneath his attention. Judge, I will write her a check right now. I will give her $10,000, $20,000, just, please, seal that document. Do not send that to the Revenue Service. That is when the first tear fell. It rolled down the cheek of a man who owned 30 properties and thought he owned the world. He was crying, not out of remorse for stealing from his tenants, but out of pure, unadulterated panic that his empire of fraud was finally collapsing in front of an audience. I looked at Sarah. She was no longer shaking. The exhaustion that had weighed her down all morning had vanished, replaced by a quiet, dignified strength. She watched the man who had illegally locked her out of her life beg for his own. Mr. Sterling, I said, calmly folding the ledger and placing it back into the folder. You don't seem to understand how the justice system works. You don't get to buy your way out of a crime only after you've been caught committing it. Do you think you can negotiate with the bench, Mr. Sterling? I asked, my voice deadly calm. The fundamental problem with people who hoard massive amounts of wealth is that they treat every consequence like a business transaction. They genuinely believe that if they throw enough money at a problem, it will simply disappear. But justice does not have a price tag, and my courtroom is not a corporate boardroom. Richard stood there, tears now freely streaming down his perfectly manicured face, his designer suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Your Honor, please, he begged, his voice cracking. I have a family. I have investors. If this goes public, my entire portfolio will collapse. I looked at him, feeling absolutely no pity. You should have thought about your investors before you decided to build an empire on the stolen security deposits of single mothers and working-class families, I replied. I turned to my bailiff. Contact the federal prosecutor's office. Tell them we have a master ledger detailing systemic tax evasion and wire fraud, and the defendant has just confessed to its authenticity on the public record. When I gave that order, the remaining color completely drained from Richard's face. He physically stumbled backward, grabbing the wooden podium to keep himself from collapsing entirely. The visual of his psychological destruction was absolute and undeniable. This was the exact moment his privilege finally met reality. For years, Richard had bullied tenants, illegally locked them out of their belongings, and dared them to sue him, knowing they couldn't afford the legal fees. He had weaponized his power, using it as a shield to crush the vulnerable. But simple civil cases are often the most dangerous for arrogant people because they walk into court completely unprepared for someone who actually reads the evidence. He thought his status made him untouchable. He was wrong. Sarah, who had been fighting for months just to get her $5,000 back to feed her child, quietly watched as the man who tormented her faced the total destruction of his life's work. Richard Sterling was arrested 3 weeks later. The master ledger that he had so carelessly emailed to Sarah became the foundational piece of evidence in a massive federal indictment. The state attorney's office, working in tandem with federal investigators, uncovered a staggering web of deceit. Richard hadn't merely been withholding security deposits. He had been using them to inflate the apparent profitability of his shell companies, securing massive fraudulent loans from major banks, and then funneling the illicit proceeds into offshore accounts. The scale of his arrogance was matched only by the scale of his criminality. His entire empire had been built on a foundation of sand, held together by the simple assumption that people like Sarah, single mothers, working-class families, small business owners were too poor, too intimidated, and too exhausted to ever hold him accountable. He believed that because he wore expensive suits and spoke with an air of absolute authority, the world would simply bow to his version of reality. But in my courtroom, reality is determined by facts, not by net worth. The transformation of Richard Sterling remains one of the most stark examples of privilege collapse I have ever witnessed. The man who swaggered into the room treating the legal system as a minor inconvenience left the building in handcuffs, his reputation destroyed, his assets frozen, and his future entirely out of his control. Sarah, on the other hand, received a full judgment in her favor, including punitive damages for the illegal lockout. But more importantly, she walked out of that courtroom knowing that she had stood her ground against a titan and won. She refused to be intimidated by his wealth. She refused to accept that power automatically defeats persistence. Because she held her ground, a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise was dismantled. The aftermath of that single, catastrophic morning extended far beyond the walls of my courtroom. Richard Sterling, the man who believed his wealth and corporate structures made him completely immune to the law, learned a very painful lesson about accountability. The federal investigation, triggered by the very master ledger he accidentally provided, resulted in multiple federal indictments for wire fraud, tax evasion, and corporate racketeering. His offshore accounts were immediately frozen, his properties were seized by the government, and the management team he so proudly boasted about quickly turned state's evidence to save themselves. The empire he built on intimidation and the stolen security deposits of vulnerable tenants collapsed completely. Sarah Hayes received her $5,000 security deposit back, along with maximum punitive damages for the illegal lockout and emotional distress. But her true victory wasn't financial. It was the moment she stood her ground against a man who tried to make her feel entirely powerless. Innocent people often spend months preparing for the one day someone will finally listen, and Sarah's meticulous preparation dismantled a massive criminal enterprise. She refused to back down, proving that truth, when properly documented, is a force that no amount of money can defeat. I have presided over thousands of disputes, but this case perfectly redefines what power truly means in the face of the law. Richard Sterling walked into my courtroom confident, untouchable, and protected by his perceived power. He thought his wealth would carry him out the exact same door he walked in, and he believed his name would protect him. He was wrong. Privilege can buy you expensive, bespoke suits, luxury watches, and teams of accountants, but it cannot buy you immunity from reality. Arrogance blinds people to risks that would be obvious to everyone else, and contempt inevitably makes them sloppy. The next time you see someone abusing their power, or someone hiding behind a corporate name to bully those they deem beneath them, remember Richard Sterling. Remember the man who laughed at a judge's warning, only to cry when his own hubris exposed his darkest secrets. Power was never meant to be a shield for bad behavior, and justice does not care how many properties you own. At the end of the day, character is what remains when power inevitably fails.